Borderlands is one of the most influential game series of all time. And I know a lot of you think that that is an outrageous statement, but if you're willing to give me some of your time, I'll prove it to you.
You woke the wrong dog. Ah, yeah!
So let's go back to 1996 when Diablo 1 was released. I can't be too sure if this is the first of its kind, but it's the one that most people associate with loot-based action RPGs. The isometric view, clicking on scores of enemies, and then them exploding into loot. Or in Diablo 1's case, a bit more of a primitive version of that. And I'm not going to pretend that I know what it was like back then, because I was minus 2 years old when this came out. But from there, the genre flourished, and my first interaction with it was the Lionheart series. A series I had to Google because I forgot the name, but I have very fond memories of loading this thing up on our old family PC, and not really understanding what to do, but enjoying the ride nonetheless. These were more basic days for the action RPG genre. The games were slower, they were less flashy, and they were a bit more deliberate. And I noticed this when Diablo 2 Resurrected came out, and I played it for a while, but eventually fell off. I can appreciate where the genre spawned from, but the changes made to it later gel with my brain. After Lionheart, I got a copy of Untold Legends on PSP, and that game was like crack to me. Again, I don't remember the ins and outs of it, but I couldn't put the game down when I was a kid, and that started my love for action RPGs that only grew stronger and stronger as the years went on. Torchlight 1 was the first action RPG I remember fully committing to. Now, I was a dumb kid, and I'm almost certain I pirated the game, but I would look up guides on farming different weapons and how to build my character to be overpowered, and that's what did it. Before I would enjoy the simple yet fun loop of destroying enemies and getting some loot, but now I saw what this genre can be and never looked back. And for anybody wondering, I did write that wrong of pirating Torchlight 1, because when I pre-ordered Torchlight 2, it came with a copy of Torchlight 1 on Steam, so I'm sorry, Runic Games. Now you're probably asking yourself that this is a video on Borderlands, so why am I talking about all of these games? And the reason for that is because these games that I mentioned had one thing in common. Only proper nerds played. Your average Joe would struggle with the isometric view, the fantasy setting, and the clicky-clacky gameplay. Action RPGs were a genre for a certain kind of gamer. One that I was, and one that many of you watching are. But for the FIFA, Madden, and COD bros, it was way too nerdy for any of them to play. And that was until the Borderlands series was released. It came out in 2009, but I didn't play it until the Game of the Year edition came out in 2010, and I had never fallen in love with the game so quickly. I adored everything about it. The fun characters, the edgy humour that is perfect for a 12-year-old, the cel-shaded graphics that I don't think I had seen before, the endless amount of weapons, gear, and the carnage of elemental effects, damage numbers, and loot popping out left, right, and centre. Just like Torchlight 1, it showed me what this genre can be, and I was hooked. But before we get any further into Borderlands itself, let's talk about Skyrim and Elden Ring, and please bear with me on this point because it's a good one. Just like action RPGs, I loved Western narrative-heavy RPGs like Oblivion and Dragon Age Origins. The deep lore and the complicated relationship between characters, and most of all, I adored the medieval fantasy settings of these. But again, games like this were for a certain kind of gamer. While I was never bullied in school, I certainly got my fair share of slagging for playing these sorts of games. I loved FIFA and COD, but I wasn't afraid to sit down with Dragon Age for 50 hours and get lost in a world like no other. Now this all changed when a little known game called Skyrim came out, and it was the game that crossed the barrier. It proved to your average Joe gamer that RPGs can be cool. They can be something for most gamers, and there's no better example of a game bridging that gap than Skyrim. I remember those same COD players asking me questions about Skyrim in secondary school because they knew I would be playing it. And I feel like the Lord of the Rings movies had a similar effect in the early 2000s, where people who pored over Tolkien's work were giant nerds, but then the movies dropped and everybody all of a sudden loved medieval fantasy. And the same can be seen with Game of Thrones later on. One more game that bridged that gap was Elden Ring. Souls-likes were for an even more niche player than something like Oblivion or Skyrim. But Elden Ring knocked down that wall between the two, and once again, people who had never touched a Souls-like wanted to know what all the fuss about Elden Ring was for. And it was for a good reason. Skyrim and Elden Ring stuck to their roots. Skyrim felt like any other Bethesda game, but it was easier to get into than Oblivion. And Elden Ring is still tough, but the devs added loads of things from Ashes of War or a non-linear game structure to help new players along. Sometimes all games are missing is one or two elements that will make it easier for new players to get into, and then it spawns a whole new love for a lot of people for a genre that they previously would have never touched. And that brings me on to the Borderlands series. Diablo and Torchlight were for nerds who hid in their parents' basement and just clicked away to their heart's content. FPS was for the cool kids. So what happens when you combine the two? Well, you get one of the most influential games of all time, and that is Borderlands 1. So we have to go back to the turn of the decade. Borderlands dropped to some great reviews, with a Metacritic score of 84. And I went back to watch some of the old reviews, and a lot of them praised the game for the same things I would. The randomly generated weapons, the unique art style, and the funny writing. But the main point they all bring up is that this is a wholly unique experience back then. Nowadays we have Destiny, Outriders, and The Division, which offer a similar experience to what Borderlands did all them years back. But Borderlands was the first of its kind. It's funny watching the IGN review because Charles Onyett brings up how it might look like a typical FPS, but underneath it all is a load of loot and number crunching. And I think that's the reason why it resonated with so many non-action RPG fans. It's like they saw a new co-op shooter and thought it would be a great time to sit down with their friends. But once they got into it, their eyes were open to a whole other set of systems that they never had really interacted with before. Even anecdotally, I had plenty of friends in school that I would play COD or FIFA with, and they were interested in Borderlands. I opened the pitch telling them how much it was like COD, and then everyone was in. I convinced 2 of my friends to get it, and we played it non-stop. Now, I'm no longer in contact with them, but I wonder if they are addicted to Diablo 4 because of Borderlands 1. Of course, Borderlands kind of created the genre of looter shooters, or at the very least popularised it. But I don't think it gets enough credit for a couple of things. The PS3 era was an era of browns, greys, and even more browns. And as a result, most of the games are visually dull. Borderlands is kinda no exception. As in, it's filled with browns and greys, but at the very least it had the unique cel-shaded aesthetic that made the boring colours pop more than the likes of Gears of War or Call of Duty or most games that released around 2010. Another thing that they got so right was the enemy design. Throughout a playthrough, they do get kinda samey, but if you're going for iconic enemy design, the Skag and Psycho are brilliant. And I think most people would think of a Psycho before anything else when they think about Borderlands. Now going back to it, it's still fun. I have a massive amount of nostalgia for Borderlands, and it's one of my favourite series of all time. But the game was just a proof of concept. It feels quite basic and unrefined now. The level design is probably the biggest problem, with the dungeons being one-way streets with no shortcuts. So for a lot of them you have to run through, fight the boss, then turn around and walk all the way back to the start. And in general the areas almost look identical for the majority of the game. And then there's other things like a lack of enemy variety, and the guns eventually kind of feeling all the same. The loot is obviously nowhere near as bonkers as Borderlands 2, but it's like Borderlands 1 crawled so that Borderlands 2 could fly. Borderlands 2 solidified the genre. It improved upon everything that Borderlands 1 did. The characters were more prominent, with crazier personalities, and better yet, more childish writing that you either love or hate. But where it improved the most was the gameplay loop. The game just feels better, and that's hard to describe in words. It's something you feel the second you play the game. Characters move more fluidly, guns give more audio and visual feedback, and everything just looks better. It leaned into the 2 best aspects, the randomized guns and the wacky enemy designs, giving us more enemy types like bots, Varkids and Bullymongs, and it tweaked things ever so slightly, like having different colour health bars for enemies that were weak to different elements, and introducing slag weapons, which were weapons that debuffed enemies, making them more susceptible to elemental damage. And these became really useful as you started to get into the ultimate Vault Hunter mode in New Game Plus 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I can't think of anything that Borderlands 2 did worse than the first, and it truly has some of the best DLC packs of any game ever created. I mean, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep eventually spawned its own game, but it's creative, funny, and it showed off some serious story chops that Borderlands can have, which is something I love the franchise for, but you know, a lot of people ignore. I understand that, but I love the story of these games. And that brings me on to the series as a whole, which is in such a weird spot right now. Borderlands 2 was released in 2012, and the pre-sequel, which was done by a different team, released in 2014, and then we had to wait 5 more years for Borderlands 3. And at that point, the Borderlands moment was over. Now, it still sells well even to this day, and I know Take-Two are very happy with the sales of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. They never gave actual numbers, but the franchise is still popular. It captured so many people because of how unique it is. And as much as I love Borderlands 3, it didn't have even close to the same impact because the industry had moved on to these ever-evolving looter shooters like Destiny, and Borderlands felt like it was stuck in a limbo. Every series under the sun now needs live service elements, or even adapts the whole game into some live service stuff that doesn't make any sense. I enjoyed Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Rocksteady made a fun and engaging loop that I got hooked on, with all the different bits like countering enemies, meleeing for shields, all while managing traversal abilities to zip around the map. It was a lot of fun, but it's clear from the content rollout that they didn't know how to support a live service game, and maybe Gearbox were afraid of the same thing. It's clear that the live service model isn't working for Suicide Squad, and it didn't really make sense. But you know what does make sense? A Borderlands live service game. And I'm kind of in two minds with this, because on one hand, I've had a great time with the likes of Destiny, where I could play it for hours upon hours and enjoy the content rollout. And I feel like most looter shooters are in that situation where they kind of have this 5 or 10 year content plan where they're rolling things out and they have all these updates planned. And then on the other hand, I like how Borderlands 3 and Tiny Tina's Wonderland replicated what it did back in 2009. In a world where everything is a live service game, especially in the looter shooter genre, to me, Borderlands actually stands out just as much now as it did back in 2009, because it has this dedication to a single player story with a season pass or two of DLC packs like the old days. So if they did announce Borderlands 4 being a live service game, I don't think I would be particularly annoyed, because I do want more Borderlands and I kind of want constant updates to a Borderlands game, but I think I'd miss out on some of that unique footprint that Borderlands does have over, say, Destiny or Diablo 4 or The Division.
Gaston attacked me. He's gone. He's barricaded himself in the basement, performing the sacrament of Bog.
It directly brought action RPGs to the average gamer, and now years on, it has indirectly brought MMOs to them too. I mean, Destiny and The Division and games like that are two of the biggest multiplayer series going right now. And just like Skyrim did to Western RPGs, Destiny did to MMOs. It might be slightly different to the likes of WoW, but it has the same premise. Always online, players running around fighting each other and enemies, questing together, doing dungeon runs and trying their hands at raiding. And the whole point of this video is about how a lot of gamers are closed off to certain genres for one reason or another. And realistically, a lot of the genres we ignore have games that we would certainly love. And sometimes all you need is just a different perspective. It could be the literal swap of perspective, like the switch from isometric to first person in the case of Borderlands. Or maybe it's a tweak to the setting, like WoW to Destiny. Or sometimes we just need to open our mind a bit and we find something that we absolutely love. Borderlands was the catalyst for many people getting into action RPGs, and it spawned all of these fantastic looter shooters like Destiny, The Division, Outriders. I love all of them games. And without Borderlands, we wouldn't have any of them. And that's why it's one of the most influential game series of all time.